Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
It's The In Show, Australia's only show dedicated to innovation from Adelaide, Australia and across the globe.
It's David Grice and Troy Sincock. We talk to big people with big ideas, those people that are out to change the world, and the future looks very bright in their hands.
Sure does. And when we're talking big, we're actually not talking size. We're talking big people in terms of what they're able to achieve.
That's right. Although some of them are bigger than others. They come in all shapes and sizes, and that's what's so great about it.
Absolutely.
It literally is just someone who, instead of just having the idea and thinking, someday maybe I might look at that, and then, inevitably someone else comes up with the idea. These are people that actually have the idea and go, we work out how we could see if this is possible.
Amazing people, aren't they? And their minds, the way they think, just thinking about, just everyday things and how different they view these things, through the lens that they have.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary curiosity that all of these people seem to have. And I tell you what, something that I'm really curious to find out about is Hybrid World Adelaide. It's on July 20 to 24th at the Adelaide Convention Centre. And when I say I'm curious, is because I suppose what Hybrid World Adelaide does is almost puts the future right in front of you. It's like you get to see what the jobs of the future are going to be and what is possible with technology. And
we had a great experience with Hybrid World last year, and some of the people we got to talk to were just fascinating people. We had a guy that's putting silicon chips in cows so they can measure the meat and the quality of the meat, and then feed the beef when they're young so that the meat improves before they sell it as stuff we eat. Things like that is just mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, they cover all sorts of things like, drones and coding. There's video gaming sessions, robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, all that kind of stuff. We have got a couple of tickets to give away at the end of this podcast. So stick around, enjoy what you're about to hear, or alternatively, just go right to the end.
No, don't go to the end.
You actually don't go to the end, because Paddy Neumann is a fascinating guy. We caught up with him recently. He's the founder and chief scientist at Neumann Space. They're based here in Adelaide, the startup. But they won't be a startup for long. I mean, what this guy has come across is phenomenal.
And how he's come across it too. Just mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah. I started by just asking him, how things began, given when he walked into our space, he started telling me immediately how the microphone operated. I asked him whether he felt that he'd always looked at the world differently.
A little bit, yeah. You walk around, you pay attention to what's happening, and I'm told this is not particularly common, but there are people around, and I appear to be one of them, who look at what's happening and they just got to know. They've got to have a tinker, they've got to have a play, they've got to find out. If you have a look at a lot of small children, a lot of babies, they want to do this. This is an instinctive part of being human. But something weird happens in primary school where this gets trained out of people, so that the people who can continue doing this are those who are stubborn and bloody-minded enough to continue wanting to take things apart, to continue wanting to know what happens when you get right into the guts of it. And if you also happen to be good at concentration, maths, and passing exams, these people can often become engineers and scientists.
That makes perfect sense. That being said, though, I've heard that you had been known to fall asleep during lectures. So how did you manage to navigate your way through that?
Yeah, it's a terrible thing, really.
I think we all fall asleep during lectures, don't we?
Yeah, but sometimes it's, someone delivering their research, and it can be absolutely fascinating. I was sitting in a talk a few years back. These guys from the Czech Nuclear Science Research Institute were talking about a joint venture they had with ANSTO, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, looking at effectively a digital camera, but for X-rays, so that it had the fast response time, high resolution, and also energy resolution, so that you could pick what contrast agents you wanted to scan for with your X-rays and get really fine-grained results. And I stayed awake through the method and the circuitry architecture and how the code works, and I started nodding off when they got to results, and nodding off, and you come back to seeing the new slide up, and there's weird, bizarre, surreal things like, and this is the iron line, and you can see the blood, and this is the calcium line, and this is all the bones, and this is this one and the other and the third, and this weird, different amounts of interior of mouse. So it can be quite strange and quite confronting. It also doesn't lend well to being able to pass the courses which are based around lectures. So not failing your degree is an important part of going to university, and I wish the best of luck to any students who might still have any exams going on at this time. I decided that one of the best things I could do to try and get around this would be to do as many practical projects as I could, so that I'd be active, I'd be in the lab, I'd be doing something, I'd be taking stuff apart and seeing how it works, and not really falling asleep, really. So,
I think they combat that these days with videoing all the lectures and giving audio of them as well. So if you miss them, you're okay.
Exactly. So as a kid, were you pulling apart things, and can you give me your first experience of that?
I helped my brother Magnus with the vacuum cleaner, helped both of my brothers with various automotive things over the years. We had a little property up in the hills of Perth and did a little bit of hydraulics, i.e. putting in our own reticulation system and getting our own grey water attachments going. So you put a funnel into the outlet valve for the washing machine, goes into a holding tank, and then take the hose down to the orange tree or the lemon tree or whatever could do with some more nitrogen and phosphorus.
Mm. And how did you then, choose what it was that you wanted to do with your life? Were you clear that, by the time you got to university that, I want this to be my life?
I'd always been interested in science and technology. And, well, as a really little kid, like 3, I thought trains were awesome. Because, big, huge machines going along. And I was a tiny little kid. And I thought they were great. And then I figured out that we don't really build trains very much these days. And if you drive trains, you do the same thing day in, day out. And that might get a bit boring. So, all right, we go and think about something else. And then I found out about dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are really cool. And then I read that they might have been wiped out by an asteroid. So I looked into what an asteroid was. And then I thought that dinosaurs died a long time ago. So eventually we're going to find out everything we can about dinosaurs. But space keeps going on forever. So I started reading stuff about space and space technology, space probes, space missions, all these things. And decided that this is something I'd like to try and get into, recognizing just how hard it would be for a kid on the outskirts of Perth. Did the usual thing that they say you should do as a kid, study hard, eat your veg, try and sleep lots, but you know how it goes, doesn't always work out. At the end of it, though, I was lucky enough to head off to the International Science School, which is a science camp that runs every 2 years at the University of Sydney. And there's lots of tours, lots of lectures, lots of discussions. And on some of those tours and some of those discussions, I was talking with the people in the plasma physics department there. And they were doing interesting things with materials physics and the vapor deposition as well as fusion plasmas. And I thought, this is a place that does both aerospace engineering and plasma physics. These are the things I want to study. So Sydney became top of my list. Did well enough in my Year 12 exams to be able to get into Sydney Uni and double degree in aerospace and physics. Did also well enough that I could actually get a scholarship and afford semi-nutritious food as well as rent in Sydney. Because that's always an issue.
Yes.
And then ran into the whole, fall asleep in lectures, what the hell am I going to do about it? Started doing projects.
Fantastic.
Tell us about the plasma physics, because probably a lot of our listeners don't really sort of look at the world in that light. So could you just perhaps unpack that for us?
Yeah, cool, no worries. Plasma comes from a Greek word meaning the stuff we made. People out there might know about blood plasma. And you get blood plasma in a fairly simple way. You get your blood sample, you put it into a centrifuge, and you spin the hell out of it. And you get these red cells, and we call them red blood cells. And you get these white cells, and we call them white blood cells. And then you get this yellowish stuff that you make. And if you call it yellowish stuff, people will laugh at you. So you call it stuff that you made, but in Greek. And if you call it plasma, it sounds a lot classier. Similarly, when they were first doing experiments with decent vacuum tubes, you get a long glass tube, you put in a positive part of a circuit in one end and negative at the other, and you suck most of the air out of it, but there's a little bit in there. You put a high voltage between those two electrodes, and you can make this glowy stuff in the middle. And if you call it glowy stuff, people will laugh at you. Mm-hmm. But if you call it a photoluminous plasma, it sounds a whole lot classier. That's basically the plasma I use is this glowy stuff. And it's all over the place. Fire is a kind of plasma. Lightning is a kind of plasma. The sun is numerous kinds of plasma in a ball 1.5 million Ks across. The very thin, very tenuous gas between stars is a different type of plasma as well. Most of the universe is a plasma of one form or another, and there are various people who study the various different plasmas, looking at their properties, looking at potential applications. Me, I studied the plasmas created by a cathodic arc discharge, which works kind of like an arc welder. If you've never used an arc welder and you don't know what I'm talking about, you've probably seen one on telly or in the movies. You often see them in the background of the scene where the supervillain's detailing their plans. You'll see someone, for some reason, welding together skyscrapers, girders. It looks cool, we'll just go with it. But they put down the face mask and there's this bright blue flash of light and sparks fly everywhere. That blue light, that comes from the welding plasma, which is material being stripped off the end of the welding rod, generally iron and carbon, and then moved through the welding arc onto the bits you're welding together. And the system I work with uses similar physics, uses a different geometry, and it puts it in a vacuum chamber, and people use it in industry to grow very thin films of one material onto a substrate material to change the surface properties, in case you want more biocompatibility for hip replacements, or different electrostatic and electrodynamic effects for touch screens, or diamond-like carbon onto tool steels for diamond drill bits, or for increasing the lifespan of hard drives. So plasma, you can think of it as like a fourth state of matter. You've got solids, liquids, gases. Plasmas are hot, glowy gases that are electrically active as well, so you can grab them with electric and magnetic fields and make them do stuff. And whatever stuff you want, well, you tell it what to do, and it's kind of beholden to the laws of physics.
So when you discovered that you had that power, there's this thing that can really move things around it that perhaps others hadn't seen. Where did your mind start going? Like, were you immediately thinking space at that point?
Well, I'll take a step back for that one. The project I worked on when I was in third year was to map the electric fields and voltages inside a given plasma discharge through time and space. And it sounds like a lot of science fiction, but you put the probe into the plasma at different points, that's mapping it through space, and you have very, very good instruments so you can look at various time points during this pulse of plasma. This very short, sharp pulse might last for only 100 microseconds. So you need very good instrumentation, but you can see how it changes during the pulse and along the plasma discharge as well, thus through time and space. And if you think about it, you have your plasma being created at one end of the vacuum chamber, and you stick your probe in halfway along. And when you turn on the plasma, it takes a certain amount of time for the plasma to move over to where your probe is. The electrons, because they're the lightest, they move fastest. So if you measure the voltage of the plasma, you'll measure a voltage dip. And then when the fastest ions start catching up, you'll measure a raise in voltage as you get the positive ions negating somewhat the effect of the negative electrons. And then it'll steady state and calm down, and things will go quite happily along for the next couple hundred microseconds. And you turn off your plasma, there's still plasma flowing along, so you still measure the steady state until the tail end of the plasma moves past, in which case you go back up to ground. So with this, you can determine how fast the fastest ions and how fast the slowest ions are moving. And with a bunch of different measurements at the same conditions, you can figure out what statistical distribution the ion energies have. And using a little bit of statistical analysis, you can figure out how fast the average effective ion velocity is. And it turns out that in the discharge I was looking at titanium ions, and at the conditions I was looking at, the average velocity was about 23 kilometers per second.
It's lightning.
Yeah.
That's really fast.
They're going places. There's not a lot of them. Each pulse is, maybe a dozen micrograms, but the ones that are moving, that have been liberated off by the plasma discharge and are streaming downrange, they're going. So I thought to myself, you could probably make a rocket thruster out of this, because one of the types that is used today, called the Hall effect thruster, it tends to have an average effective exhaust velocity of about 18 kilometers per second. So it's 5 k's a second better than that already. And this is just me stuffing around in the lab looking at data from a different project. So I thought, all right, this might be something worth doing some more investigation on. And I'm going to need an honours project in about a year and a half. So I talked to my physics supervisors, and they were fine for me to continue with the project. I got one of the academics in engineering to sign the paperwork, because engineering is my senior faculty at UCID. So paperwork got signed. I did my project under supervision in the physics building. And yes, this is a thruster. I measured the thrust using a simple pendulum system. I had a little bit of pendulum made out of a space-age polymer formula that looks for all the world like overhead projector film, because it is overhead projector film, and put that in the way of the plasma stream and measured how fast it got swung back by using a laser occultation method. I put a little grid on the back of the pendulum, shone a laser through it, off a mirror, and then onto a sensor, so I could measure how much light was going through and know the difference in spatial position between lines on this grid, and I know how much time it takes for the pendulum to swing. I can measure how fast it's going and thus how much force has been delivered. Nice, repeatable, linear results. Where it stopped being linear was at a point that made sense. We could explain what was happening in view of known theory, which was all good. My master's project was having a look at what shape of cathode and anode geometry was the best, and also how do we define best in this circumstance. And it turned out that the geometry we were using all along was the best. It's good to be sure of this.
Yeah.
And my PhD was to test 11 different materials to see what their efficiencies are under various different conditions after, doing a bit of a literature search to select these 11 candidate materials, as well as planning my experiments so I'd be able to figure out not only how much force they're producing, but how much material is being blasted off the cathode to produce this, so we know how efficient the system is.
Did you blow anything up in the process?
Yep. Yep. A couple of things went pop. A couple of times it was putting too much current through hockey puck silicon control rectifiers. So these pieces of semiconductor hardware that are about 2 inches across. They're rated to 5,000 amps as their peak pulse current, and I put 5,500 amps through one a couple of times. So, it's above what it's meant to handle, so of course it broke. Another time was burning out some of the coils inside an old oil-filled transformer that looks like it's from the 1950s. So we had to ring around a large number of places to say, hi, we've got this old transformer, we need it fixed. Can you guys do it as well as fill it up with oil again? Apparently that oil has now been banned for being carcinogenic, teratogenic, and mutagenic. So getting new oil was a bit of a challenge.
That really is amazing. And did you have a moment, through all your experimentation where you just went, wow, I've really got something here?
Yeah, but that wasn't how I thought about it. So the data that comes out is a bunch of squiggly lines, and it gets graphed, and you output that as a large array of numbers, and you put it through your processing, and then you basically do the data processing procedure, and you start putting data points on a graph and seeing what it looks like. And first couple of data sets I processed were for a couple of fairly dense, fairly refractory, well-behaved metals. I believe it was vanadium and tungsten. Tungsten is one of the metals that gets used for old incandescent light bulb filaments, and vanadium doesn't get used by itself a lot, but it's a really important catalyst in industry as well as alloying material for certain grades of steel. And they worked pretty well. They were getting, the data I was looking at was about what I was expecting, and then I looked at my magnesium data, and I was expecting to get measurements of a quantity called specific impulse in the 3,500 to 4,500 range. Specific impulse is one of the metrics that people use to describe the efficiency of a rocket motor. It's how much momentum change you can get from a given weight of propellant. So it's kind of like miles per gallon, but for spaceships. The units for it are units of time, because one of the ways of thinking about it is, let's say I've given you a pound of fuel. You put it into your rocket motor, and you turn on your rocket, and you dial it down, you throttle the rocket so that it gives you a continuous pound force of thrust. And it'll take a certain amount of time for your rocket to burn through its pound of fuel, giving you a continuous pound of thrust. And the number of seconds that takes, that's your specific impulse. So the more seconds it takes, obviously the more efficient your system is at turning fuel into thrust. So bigger numbers are better numbers under this particular metric in this circumstance. So I was expecting numbers in the 3,500 to 4,000, maybe 4,500 range. I was getting numbers around 9,000.
Wow.
And I thought, I've made a mistake. It's easily twice as big as what I've got. If it was half of that, yeah, that'd be a really nice improvement over current state of the art. Obviously, I've got a factor of 2 in there somewhere. Let's try and find it. So I went through all of my algorithms, all of my data, processed it again, same effect. Went back, took the data again, same effect shown. So I was pretty confident that it was a real effect. And looking at the rest of the data sets, they were often a bit higher than what I was expecting based on other people's work previously. I was expecting a little bit better, not as much better as what I was getting, but the University of Sydney apparatus is the highest power apparatus of its type in the world. So it can do things to the plasma that no one else is able to do, no one else has been able to see, which goes some way to explain why having these large currents and large energies in the plasma were doing so much better than what other groups at University of California, Berkeley and the others were getting in their research. So it wasn't more of a case of, wow, this is amazing. When I first saw it, I was like, nah, I've stuffed up. Nah, I've made a mistake. Let's go and find out where it is, be good scientists and try and get all the mistakes out.
So tell us where this is taking you now. So you are now into the world of space and rockets and all sorts of stuff like that. So share with us how that's now applying to what you do.
Sure. After writing up my thesis and submitting it, myself and a couple of friends decided that going commercial would probably be the best way of making this real, because this was back in 2015 when I did my final submission, and an Australian space agency was not even a glimmer in anyone's eye at this point in time. And the normal way this is meant to happen, when you have someone that comes up with something interesting at a university or a corporate research lab, is it gets the attention of their national agency, and they get some grants and they do the development and they improve the technology and iron out all the wrinkles, and in 10, 15 years' time, you've got a new technology that is able to be put in space as part of a technology demonstration mission, and everyone's going to be pretty sure that it's going to work. Couldn't do that, didn't have a space agency, didn't want to move overseas with it. Could have kept it as a university project and tried to go through the various grant cycles, but believe the number I'd heard for the successful grant applications to first-time grant appliers in 2014, something around 8%. Because part of the criteria is, do you have a good research record? Have you been part of successful grants beforehand, not as primary researcher, but as one of the other people on the grant listing? This would have been my first time listing. Their odds were not particularly good. So we opted to spin it out as a commercial enterprise and move forward with it. And that's what we've been doing these last couple of years. Myself and the team, and of course there is a team because there's a multitude of things at which I'm terrible, and the rest of the team help to address those inadequacies in things like real-time control systems and circuit design and the like. And what we've been doing is working on upgrading the system, moving it from laboratory prototype through engineering models through to more advanced prototypes, with the eventual goal of having ourselves something that we can put in space and be confident it will work.
And when you talk about, putting something in space, what I suppose when I think of space, I think of, people being in space. Is that sort of the ultimate goal? Is that what you're looking to do, or is it literally just, what's the most efficient way of propelling stuff into space so we can capture research and things like that?
Well, with us, it's we won't be doing the surface to orbit leg. Our system, it's an electrical propulsion system, so it's low thrust, high efficiency. Once you're already in space, that's where our system can help you out.
Gotcha.
Because it can give you the little bit of thrust to keep your satellite in the correct orbit, to counteract drag from the atmosphere if it's in a low orbit. If it's in a higher orbit, there's very little drag, but there's still the gravitational perturbations from the moon, from the sun, from everything else in the universe, just tugging it out of where you want it to be. And so you need a thruster, you need a little baby rocket to keep your satellite in the correct spot. And that's where we come in. With our very high efficiencies, we can do that orbital station keeping, it's called, while using very little fuel. And because it's expensive to launch that fuel mass into orbit, this means a saving for the owner-operator, for the satellite manufacturer, and the like. Additionally, if you're trying to change orbits, the more fuel-efficient your system is, the less fuel you need with you. On the other hand, ours is an electrical system. It will take a lot more time than turning on a chemical rocket. Depending on what you want, depending on what you have, this may make sense. If you want to send people to the moon, however, probably not going to make sense unless you have a huge amount of power behind you, because people transiting the Van Allen belts pick up a lot of radiation, and people tend to be far less tolerant of radiation than electronics. And so you wanted them moving through it as quick as possible.
Sure. And so, when you say that, this can save a lot of money, and, you can ensure that these satellites remain where they were intended to be, like, what sort of savings are we talking about?
Okay. There's a fantastic paper you can find online by Dr. Brian Benedict, who at the time was working for Intelsat General. And this paper he gave at a conference, and it wasn't even a subtext of, can someone please figure out how to do space tugs or on-orbit refueling? This is how much money you'd make. Because he was approaching it from the point of view of somebody who works for a company who owns a large number of geosynchronous orbit communication satellites. And they're saying, okay, one towards the end of its lifespan, it might have half of its transponders still working. Each one of those will be worth so many $1 million for its bandwidth, and so you get roughly $50 million a year from this satellite. If you can deliver a lifetime extension that costs less than this value, this might be of interest to people, because it means they can keep their satellites going for that little bit longer and plan their fleet replacement schedule a little bit better with more confidence. So if you can give this $50 million a year satellite another 10 years of life, that's a $500 million revenue you weren't expecting. If that total cost is $20 million a year, that's $300 million in profit you weren't expecting. That's the cost of your new satellite right there. The amount of fuel that gets used to do station keeping is a fair amount of what gets delivered to the destination orbit, especially if they're using legacy technologies such as hydrazine thrusters. A lot more of the modern satellites are using electric propulsion systems like the gridded ion thruster or the Hall effect thruster to do their station keeping, and in some cases they're orbit raising to get to their destination orbit. These systems save a lot of launch mass, to the extent that Boeing, I think it was a year and a half ago, released a picture where they had two of a given satellite bus, I believe it's the 702 SP, but it could have been the 702 MP, stacked one on top of the other so that they could launch two on the one rocket where they'd ordinarily only be able to launch one, because they have to launch so much less fuel, and the satellite still gets to the job site, still gets to its destination orbit, still has enough fuel on board to last for 15, 20 years. With our system, we need even less fuel. The wonderful thing about how the equations work is, if you want to take fuel to move somewhere, you need the fuel to move the fuel, right? So it's literally an exponential dependence. The more efficient your thruster is, the exponentially better your deliverable mass is. So going from a flight-rated ion thruster, which has a specific impulse of about 3,500, up to our thruster using some of the mid-range fuels that are pretty good, pretty solid, like molybdenum, titanium, vanadium, carbon, at 5,000 seconds, it's not that you get half again the improvement. It's closer to about 3 times. So that's 1/3 the fuel mass. If you go to the very efficient fuel, the most fuel-efficient fuel we've tested to date, which is magnesium, that gets up to 10,000 seconds.
Wow.
To put the amount of fuel you need to do a month's orbital maintenance in perspective, if you've got a fairly medium-sized communication satellite that weighs about 4 tons dry, and you want to keep it in the right spot for a month, you'd need about 110 grams worth of magnesium to do that. That's about the size of the novelty 2-pack of Mars bars you get down at the service stations.
Yes.
Yeah. So not a lot of mass. And it's about that same volume, because magnesium's also a fairly light metal.
That is absolutely staggering to think of, the implications of what you have created here. I mean, clearly that means dollar signs, but I don't think that you're the kind of guy that, it's going to be enough that you just make some money and you buy a big house and then you sit down watching TV for the rest of your life. Clearly, like, you're up to big things. Do you have this, when a company goes, okay, we'll take that. That's great. That's going to save us a lot of money. Here's a bunch of cash. what then becomes possible for you? Like, is there something that you really want to achieve?
Well, there's things that I want to see done with a thruster. Assuming large company X comes along and says, Paddy, sweetie, baby, we love it. Have a gigantic bucket of money. We'll be using it, no worries. And I'll say, great, fine, fantastic. You've got large amounts of talented engineers and technicians to make it happen. This is great. We've done what we can, no worries. Or if it's a case of, we love it, we love what you're doing with it, we'll just buy it off you guys keep making it, that's also fine. But what I love about the system is the things it can enable. And it's not just the short-term things like better station keeping and better orbit delivery. Our system uses solid conductive propellants. It uses metals and carbon as fuel. And if you're in low Earth orbit, the closest and most dependable source of metallic feedstock for your propulsion system is space junk. Now,
Right.
you need to sort out the legalities and the ownership and insurance and all these fine things that do need to be sorted out. But if you took care of people's mess for them, took it away, recycled it, and turned the good propellant feedstocks into fuel for your junk hunter, you can go off and grab the next target and bring it back. Terrible fuels, make into rod stock, sheet stock, I-beams, whatever, so the people who want to do manufacturing in space can build the large habitats that people want to have to live in for gigantic space telescopes with a main dish 100 meters across, or whatever it is they want. Really bad fuels, such as 60-year-old circuit boards, not really much you can do with that. You get the metals off it, especially the platinum groups, and you use them as catalysts in your orbital chemical industry, or as I like to call it, life support system. And the circuit boards, strap it to the outside, use it as extra radiation shielding. If you're going to kill some space junk, you might as well use all the carcass, right?
Yeah.
So that's a use case for it. It's a potentially economically viable way of dealing with space junk, which is becoming more and more of a problem. Additionally, we have the fuel efficiency that might make asteroid mining a viable concern for people in orbit to get more feedstocks at lower price. It might take a bit longer, but this might be an option. It might also be an option to get some of the very rare elements that we need for certain specialized applications, and this may be economically viable as a supporting activity for the orbital water delivery and steel delivery business. Additionally, the huge amount of fuel efficiency we've got allows a lot more things to happen in the solar system. When you've got the efficiency we've demonstrated for magnesium, every percentage point of mass on your vehicle that is fuel. So if 10% of your mass is fuel, you've got 10% fuel mass, right? Every percentage point is roughly a kilometer a second of velocity change. One of the ways of describing how difficult it is to change your orbit is by how much you need to change your velocity to go from one orbit to the other. If you want to go from low Earth orbit, spiral out to the edge of Earth's gravitational sphere of influence and let the sun's gravity take over, then spiral through the solar system, get to Mars, and then spiral into a low Mars orbit, that'll take about 14.5 kilometers per second of velocity change. So if 30% of your vehicle in low Earth orbit is fuel, that's Mars orbit and back without needing to refuel.
Wow.
Jeez.
That's mind-boggling.
It really is.
Yeah. It's so exciting. I mean, and to think that you kind of literally, your discovery, you've been able to kind of have complete ownership of it in as much as you've not really had to change anything. You've been able to pursue this your own way in Australia. How did it go from, you having this discovery and then going, well, what's going on around me here? Where are the industries and all that kind of, what am I going to need to do it to what it is now, which seems to have moved like very quickly. Adelaide is fast becoming this real destination for space organisations. How has that come about, and what has that made possible for you now?
For us, the first thing is, of course, ownership, especially for the intellectual property. The intellectual property policy at the University of Sydney is that everything a student discovers, develops, invents, while they're a student, as part of their work as a student, that belongs to the student. However, there's always the argument that there might be a little bit of advice and guidance coming from the supervisors, which are university employees generally. So getting this sorted was one of the first things we did. Mm-hmm. We went and talked to the IP people at UCID and got the rights assigned to the inventors, and we formed the company and assigned the rights to the company. Mm-hmm. So then we could go with the important next step of, okay, we've got these rights. It's a bright idea. Parts of it have been validated in the lab at the University of Sydney, which we have no access to because we're an independent company now. And while we could do the negotiations for this, we opted to do this independently. This isn't cast no aspersions on the university at all. It's just that the apparatus, it's for university purposes, for teaching, for research, and we'd be doing something entirely out of that purview, and it wouldn't really be what we wanted to. Mm-hmm. So we formed the company and had to think about where we would set ourselves up, how we would go about getting investment, how this would all work. And where we would set ourselves up was an interesting discussion point. I'm from Perth. Perth does a bit of manufacturing and a bunch of maintenance and a little bit of heavy industry, generally to support mining applications. Not much in the way of aerospace. Not much in the way of bulk manufacturing. Sydney has been losing its manufacturing base for a while now because the land's just getting too expensive. Victoria still does a bunch of manufacturing, especially in the power system side of things. However, Adelaide's where Australia does the bulk of its defence and aerospace manufacturing. The various prime aerospace companies that do manufacture in Australia, at least some of the components for their overseas footprints, they tend to do a lot of that in Adelaide. So it has the mature aerospace manufacturing ecosystem. It has the contractors who are able to feed into this ecosystem. It has the people who have the skills and the equipment, and importantly, the quality certifications, so that the things we need built can get built and to the standard that we need them. Mm. So we moved over here to South Australia about the same time that Fleet and Innovor and Myriota were being founded and moving forward and doing excellent things. Mm. It seems that South Australia is where a lot of new space startups in Australia seem to be clustering, because there's the manufacturing history, there's a manufacturing tradition, there's a very supportive state government, there's a very supportive populace about this, and you've got to go somewhere for this. Adelaide is one of the more livable cities in the world, and it has a far cheaper standard of living at a good standard than Sydney or Melbourne.
Mm-hmm. And how do you find yourself working with the infrastructure around you? Do you work outside the company getting advice, and do you assist them? What are those type of arrangements?
Without straying into the territory covered by non-disclosure agreements, yes, of course. We've been asked to deliver little studies and discussion points, as well as present at conferences and little discussion sites about what space can do, what Australians are doing and can continue to do in space, so that the sector can get built up. Mm. Part of it is you go around and you just have a look at all the research everyone has done. One of the things that the European Space Agency did was sit down and work out the numbers of, okay, how much return on investment do you actually get out of putting money into space? Mm. And the answer is they found that for every euro a government put in, between 4 and 12 euros of direct economic benefit came back to the country. Mm. Mm. So it's one of the better ways of investing in your nation, investing in the future. So they're not slouches at the South Australian government. So of course they would have had a look at these reports and gone, well, okay, we'll help this along. We'll do what we can. Mm. The feds seem to have got that memo as well. And here we are looking forward to more interesting things happening with a federal agency.
Mm. And speaking of conferences, you're at Hybrid World Adelaide in a few weeks' time. What are you going to be sharing there?
Okay, so at Hybrid World, I'll be part of the Space and Emerging Technologies stream. And what I'll be talking about will help set the stage for a couple of other speakers, as well as help to give the audience a bit more background. I'll be talking about Space Missions 101. I'll be talking about what you need for a space mission, how to get those needs met, and then what you can do with it. there'll be basic bits and pieces. Every space mission, for example, has 4 main segments. You've got your launch segment, because you've got to get into space. Mm-hmm. You've got your space segment, whatever it is you're putting into space. You've got the ground segment, so whatever stays behind the ground so you can talk to the thing in space. And then the support segment, which is the everything else that holds it all together. Mm. Every space mission has this. A lot of missions share the support segment and ground segment parts. But my talk will not only describe these, but will also give examples of what Australia is doing in this space currently and what people are looking towards doing later on down the track.
Fantastic. And is there anything in the program that you've seen coming up that is really exciting you? Is this, you're going in with a completely open mind and just whatever you see is whatever you see, or is there something specific that's really striking you?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of interesting robotics and AI talks. It's also directly relevant to me. Crystal Johnson, one of the NASA bigwigs, is coming back out to Adelaide. I believe she is still, I know she was last year, the director of the Goddard Center for NASA, which is close to their headquarters in Washington. She's a very intelligent, very personable lady who's an excellent speaker. I look forward to her talk. And also seeing who's out there, seeing who's doing what is, especially biotech, AI, all these exciting new fields that are emerging and that Adelaide is doing quite well at attracting new organizations to be part of.
So do you foresee, people that, don't quite have the scientific acumen that maybe you do, or the intelligence? Can you see that, the space industry in South Australia and, Australia could well, be creating the jobs of the future for everyday people?
Yeah. There's the old Royal Air Force saying that it takes 100 people with their feet firmly on the ground to keep some fool's head in the clouds. And this is true in spades of space. Sure, you need someone with more degrees that you can fit on a regular-sized wall to come up with some of the ideas and find the orbits and find the trajectories that'll make it work. But then you need the people who can build it. You need the people who are good welders, people good riveters, fabricators. Everything needs to get built, otherwise it's just a series of elegant equations on the whiteboard. These jobs need to be done. And sure, you can try and automate a lot of these with CNC mills and robotic manufacturing methods, but at the end of the day, someone's still got to tell her what to do. Someone's got to do the design work. Someone's got to make sure that the robot's doing what it's told. Someone's got to do quality assurance. Someone's got to sweep up the floors. Someone's got to make sure payroll gets met. There's jobs in these fields still around, still going. And if space is one of the fields that Adelaide's fine manufacturing heritage and fine manufacturing capabilities can continue to contribute towards, this can only be good things for the city and the state.
Well, Paddy, you've actually made me feel like perhaps I could get involved in space. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and congratulations on the work you're doing and what you see possible for the future, and what that could mean for us all. It really is magnificent.
No worries. Thank you very much for your time.
That was Paddy Neumann, founder and chief scientist at Neumann Space, based in Adelaide, South Australia, and one of the speakers at Hybrid World Adelaide, July 20 to 24.
Yeah, can't wait to catch up with that one. I just think having him with us and understanding a little bit more of who he is, I just can't wait to hear what he's got to say.
Yeah, he is a super brain. I mean, he just... I really see the gap between him and me. Like, he is just, his head is in a whole nother area. But what I love is, while he's excited about those things, his feet are very firmly on the ground. Yes. He gets that he can't do this alone.
Yeah, and the team that he's built and how that's all sort of developed. And the journey from leaving Perth, going to Sydney to finish up here in Adelaide is just an amazing story. And look, the passion he's got for what he's doing and where he sees the future of what he's doing is just incredible.
You can take a glimpse of the future for yourself at Hybrid World Adelaide, July 20 to 24 at the Adelaide Convention Centre. You can win yourself a double pass just for listening to this podcast on the In Show. Just like and share the podcast link on Facebook and Twitter, and you're in the running. It's that simple. We're catching up with all sorts of people involved with Hybrid World Adelaide, people behind the scenes, speakers, people involved in all the areas that are covered, from, video gaming to robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, drones, coding. There's a lot of really fascinating people, and we're going to be speaking to them all on the In Show.
Yeah, and on the next podcast, we chat to another Hybrid World Adelaide guest speaker, Dr. Nick Faulkner, who's the inaugural director of the University of Adelaide's Australian Smart Cities Consortium.
The In Show. Subscribe to the In Show podcast on iTunes. Presented by David Grice and Troy Sincock. Music by Zach Grice. A Dave and the Beanstalk production.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.